The Indianapolis Colts are somewhat narrowing down their pool of finalists here for their head coaching vacancy, and we're going to talk about one of the more promising candidates in this cycle today. Let's jump into a big conversation on Bengals offense coordinator Brian Callahan. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is presented by PrizePicks, which is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their stat projections, then you can win up to 25 times your money on your first entry. First time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com. Promo code Locked On. I'm Zach Hicks, and my Jake is not here, but I'm joined by Jake Liscow of Locked On Bengals to talk about a very, very enticing, very intriguing candidate for the Indianapolis Colts in this head coaching search, Brian Callahan. So, Jake, first off, before we jump into this, I'm sorry about the crushing loss the other day. I know that was a tough one for you guys, but luckily, when you have the quarterback that you guys have, you'll probably be there every single year. So sorry about the loss of the championship game the other day.
Not the most fun time, but we've seen the Bengals do this before, and we've grown accustomed to numbing ourselves to dumb ways to lose football games, and they just didn't make enough plays in the end. And the officials will be a story to me in that game, but it's a subplot, not the main plot, because they had their opportunities and they were just too banged up with cluster injuries on the offensive line. So, sometimes it's too much to overcome.
I will tell you, man, even when you have that great quarterback and you get there so young, I mean, coming from the Indianapolis Colts perspective, Peyton Manning, we had the shoelace tackle with Pittsburgh. We had Billy Volek beating them in the playoffs. We had countless other crazy events. But luckily, when you have a quarterback of Joe Burrow's caliber, you will always be there. So that's always the thing to be excited about. But we're going to talk about something more positive for us, maybe not as positive for you guys there in Bengals country is, with success comes the potential of losing some of your coordinators. And Brian Callahan is a guy who has the Peyton Manning backing. He's been the offensive coordinator for a very good offense the last couple seasons. So before we get into some of the questions I have here, just what's your overall thoughts on Brian Callahan, the job he's done as offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals?
Well, I mean, I've talked to Brian a bunch of times throughout his career in Cincinnati, and he's just a guy that loves football more than anything else in the world. And those are the kinds of guys you want leading your football teams. He's incredibly thoughtful. I think he's great at connecting with other people. I think that when you listen to him talk, he's a good communicator. He conveys thoughts with intelligence, with a transparency that you don't see a lot around the NFL. And I think that's something that you see sometimes with young guys around the NFL too, that, they'll learn some lessons about how transparent they should or shouldn't be as head coaches. We saw that with Zach Taylor in Cincinnati, but I think he's a fantastic football mind. He's obviously got a lot of experience with some really, really high-level quarterbacks, from Peyton Manning to Matthew Stafford to Joe Burrow. And I think he'd do a good job as an offensive coordinator wherever he goes. He's young. He comes from a football family. He's been coaching for a long time. He's been connected to a lot of really successful coaches, be it his dad or other stops around the NFL. And I have a lot of positive things to say about Brian Callahan as a person.
Yeah, and before we get into, again, more of his type of coaching and what he's done with that Bengals offense and his part in that, it's interesting to me that Brian Callahan could have gone the nepotism baby route. He could have followed his dad around for years and ridden off his dad's coattails and gotten higher up jobs that way. But he seems like one of those few guys with, a father that's coaching in the league, a prominent father coaching in the league, that he didn't really like to follow his dad's coattails, stuff like that. Do you think that kind of removes him a little bit from that, again, that nepotism type, trademark that we get for guys like that?
I don't really know about all that, to be honest with you. Hard to know behind the scenes who gets what job. But I do know that he would like to work with his dad.
Yeah.
So his dad being the offensive line coach, just I think re-upped his deal in Cleveland.
Yeah.
If there was any way for him to go elsewhere as an OC, I would think it would be potentially to work with his son.
Yeah.
Something the Bengals tried to do when they hired Zach Taylor, but the then Washington football team denied permission
Mm.
for that lateral move interview from offensive line coach to offensive line coach, denied him the chance to go work with Zach Taylor, Joe Burrow, and his son Brian. And so uh, I don't know too much about why he was hired, when or where, outside of that. When I've talked to him, he's always seemed incredibly bright to me, and he's always shown the aptitude to learn and be open to new information. I don't think that he's the kind of guy that's going to be like my way or the highway. I think he's
Right.
always open to learning new things and adapting his approach. And we've seen that with some very significant changes to this Bengals offense over the last few years too.
Yeah, yeah, and talking about that Bengals offense, obviously it turned around when the guys like Joe Burrow came in and Jamar Chase and then T. Higgins obviously exploding. That offense really just took went to just another level once that talent came in. But Brian Callahan's been there through it all. He's been there through the lows and obviously the highs the last couple of years. What's kind of his involvement in that offense? Is he the primary play caller? Is it his offense, or is he mostly working with Zach Taylor and Joe Burrow and them to kind of craft this offense?
It's probably Joe Burrow's offense. I don't
Yeah.
think that the Bengals offense at this point really resembles Zach Taylor's or Brian Callahan's backgrounds in their entirety. I think they've obviously taken pieces of those things and put them into the offense, but he doesn't call the plays. Zach Taylor's been the play caller since arriving, which, several times has caused Bengals fans to ask for Brian Callahan to be given the shot to call plays. But Callahan's very involved, of course, with game planning, as any offensive coordinator is, even when he's not calling the plays in the NFL. Does a lot of work on red zone, does a lot of work on third downs for the Bengals, and is generally pretty involved with the whole game plan in general. He's communicating with Zach Taylor throughout the game. He's communicating with Joe Burrow throughout the game. And so not a play caller, but that's the only piece missing for him. And obviously there's some growth required there anytime you are calling plays for the first time. I think he has done it in his career, but hasn't done it in Cincinnati. But like I said, has a ton of major influences from, working with Peyton Manning in Denver, from working with Matt Stafford, working with John Gruden, and now working with Joe Burrow. A lot of exposure to a lot of different systems based on the guys that he's worked with. And where the Bengals eventually got to this year, which is, a collective effort of their offensive coaching staff, is a massive offensive transformation even within the year. And I think that adaptability that came with Brian Callahan as the offensive coordinator is noteworthy.
Yeah, yeah, and that was going to kind of lead to my next question here. So it might sound a little bit repetitive, but a lot of successful offensive coordinators and just play callers or even people involved in offense in the NFL have that kind of chameleon effect to them where they can kind of blend to whatever their star quarterback is. It doesn't have to be my way or the highway with offensive systems. And like you said, this is Joe Burrow's offense. This isn't Brian Callahan's offense. Just how much do you think that could help him in going to his next destination, especially if it's in Indy where they're going to be drafting a quarterback very high?
Yeah, I think that you would want to align your quarterback at least somewhat with the kinds of stuff that you're most familiar with and most comfortable running. I don't think Callahan these guys all know everything that they run in the NFL. There's only so much that gets innovated in the NFL, only so much that gets run in the NFL. Everyone's copying everybody, and some people know the details better than others. But Callahan doesn't have or hasn't recently run anyway a ton of Shanahan style staples. So if you're looking for that kind of heavy play action, boot, wide zone kind of stuff, or the kinds of things you're seeing in Miami this year, the kinds of things you're seeing in San Francisco every year, I don't think Callahan's necessarily the guy you want running that offense. But you look at the guys that he's worked with, in particular, Peyton Manning and Joe Burrow, and Joe Burrow bringing a lot of Drew Brees Saints offense with him from LSU to Cincinnati. Those are the kinds of things that you're looking for in your quarterback: the ability to process at a high level pre-snap, know where the ball should be going, get the ball out accurately and on time. He's dealt with a very diverse running game, so I'm not sure what his preferred style would be for Jonathan Taylor and that Colts team, but
Mhm.
they've this year in Cincinnati done everything, and they've done it from the shotgun, which I think is really creative. They found ways to get to pretty much everything that they could want from the shotgun, which is not very easy to do. But they essentially realized, a few games into 2022 that they're not a good under center team. Joe Burrow is more comfortable in the shotgun. They're not running the ball well under center. They went shotgun almost exclusively, not quite exclusively, but 90 plus percent of the time. And they're still improving their running game, finding ways to be more efficient, finding ways to run crunch and power and counter and same side toss plays in addition to their, zone and duo stuff, which is pretty much all they were doing before, and started implementing more and more stuff in their running game as this year went on, which I thought was pretty impressive too.
Yeah, Jake, that's awesome to hear. I love hearing just a diverse offensive coach and the way that they were able to kind of do that stuff there in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati's been really fun to watch these last couple of years on offense. Before I let you go, man, again, I appreciate your time and just jumping in about this Brian Callahan stuff. Are there some staff members there on that Bengals coaching staff that you think he would try to take with him to a place like Indy? I know Pritchard just got that extension or whatever, so he's probably the guy who would replace Callahan. But are there some guys there in Cincy that he would probably take with him?
Yeah, Troy Walters is another name to watch. He's interviewing for the offensive coordinator position in Houston with DeMeco Ryans. So he's thought of very highly. I think he is going to rise up. He's a current wide receivers coach, but I think he does have a very bright future in the NFL. Really smart, detail-oriented guy as well. He's obviously overseeing the emergence of guys like T. Higgins and Jamar Chase in this offense with Joe Burrow. And so that one stands out to me, but I'm not sure exactly where the connections would be for Brian Callahan as far as guys he would want to bring with him. He's been around in a lot of different staffs. I'm sure you've gone back and looked at all the different connections he's had and all the guys he's worked with. But if he were to leave, there's a lot of opportunity for promotion in Cincinnati too. And so that is the tricky thing there, where pitcher, you're right, he did just get the extension. He would be the heir apparent to offensive coordinator, and then they need to find a quarterbacks coach. And if Troy Walters leaves, then there's an opportunity for someone to move into the wide receiver coach job. And so all these guys in Cincinnati, very involved with game planning in different aspects, more than just their position groups. So it's hard to say who he might look to bring with him, but I think that whoever gets Brian Callahan's getting an incredible person to run their team. And I think that he has a lot of the qualities that you're looking for to be a head coach in the NFL, as long as the vision aligns. And I think that has been so important for the Bengals. Zach Taylor and Duke Tobin, the Bengals de facto GM, see the game the same way essentially. And Brian Callahan and Zach Taylor and Joe Burrow in the mix too, all see things, I think, very similarly and can communicate really at a high level about what things they want to do and how they want to take their offense. And given that experience, you could think that he could do that as long as he's aligned with, Chris Ballard and the higher ups and whoever he brings in to run his staff. And, there's probably growing pains, like we saw with Zach Taylor going from a non-play calling role to a head coach. But, you have the toolkit there in Brian Callahan to get there.
Awesome, man. Well, Jake, I appreciate you jumping on. Good luck with this all season and how you guys kind of rebuild. And, for my selfish sake, I hope they hire Brian Callahan. But for you, if they don't hire Brian Callahan, I hope he does stick there with you guys and helps you building up what you're doing there. But Jake Liscow of Locked On Bengals, guys, make sure you're giving him a follow. He's done some great work over there all season. And Jake, again, I appreciate you for joining me.
Thanks, Zach.
Cool. All right, guys. So coming up, we're going to talk about this overall head coaching search and kind of how the finalist group has gotten down to, I guess, 8 members now. So we're going to talk about that here to finish up today's show. But first, this year, the only app you need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sports book in America. That's FanDuel. And if you are new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet Super Bowl 57 with no sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a first touchdown. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Best of all, you get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All All right, guys. So again, Jake is not here. Jake Arthur is not here with me today to close this show out. So I'm going to give kind of my overall perspective on these candidates, especially Brian Callahan, who we just talked about with Jake Liscow of Locked On Bengals. First of all, just very impressed by Brian Callahan. This whole process, I've kind of done the like Jake was mentioning there. I've gone through and I've looked at potential staff connections, history, what players and other coaches have had to say about a lot of these candidates for the Colts head coaching search. And Brian Callahan was the guy who stood out to me the second the Colts announced that interview. I think he's a guy who, first off, connections to Indy with Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning speaks very highly of Brian Callahan. He has since his days in Denver, saying Brian Callahan's going to make a really good head coach one day. And now we're in the situation where he could be the Colts' next head coach. So, yeah, I think Brian Callahan's going to have that Peyton Manning backing, but also, we've seen other players, we've seen other coaches. He's worked under some really good coaches in his career. And I think there's a lot to like with Brian Callahan there. And having a guy like Jake come on the show and talk about his relationship with Brian Callahan and how he's talked to him many times and had, every conversation he's had with him, he's learned something new, and that's something great to have out of your head coach. He's a bit of a teacher and he's done some great things in his career. And I had to ask that question about the nepotism thing just because, we see this a lot in the NFL. We see a lot of guys kind of get jobs in the league because of who their father is or who their brother is or something like that. And sometimes it pays off. Kyle Shanahan is pretty on par with Mike Shanahan in terms of coaching, just a great coach, but also you get some other ones that definitely did not pan out. And from the looks of it, Brian Callahan has separated himself a lot from his father. He would still love to work with his father, but he's made his own career, not just kind of riding the coattails of his father, which I think is very important for a coach, especially a coach who got into the league the way that he did. So, yeah, Brian Callahan, a very interesting candidate, a candidate that I really like, who's been a part of winning culture in the past. And he's a guy who I think the Colts are going to really like as well. And speaking of the Colts and speaking of their finalist list, right before I jumped on to record this podcast, the Colts announced another finalist interview, which brings the total up to 8, as Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn is coming in on Thursday today, the time you guys are listening to this. He is coming in for his final interview, his second interview, which, man, I love. Let me just take a step back real quick and say, I appreciate Chris Ballard for being more thorough this time. I think Zach Kiefer of The Athletic has mentioned a couple of times now that he's had more interviews this second time, he's had more final interviews this time around than he had total interviews the first time before he hired Josh McDaniels. So he's definitely righting the wrongs of his past and trying to avoid a Josh McDaniels situation. But we are getting to the point where, Raheem Morris is a very quality candidate. Brian Callahan's a quality candidate. Shane Steichen, quality candidates, guys who, you're going to get one of those guys if they want the job. You're going to get one of them. You've had them for second interviews. You've had them, if we factor in how long their interviews have, the virtual interviews have been 4 hours long. The ones in person have been anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 hours long. You were talking to these guys for a good, again, 12 to 16 hours long. You should have a general sense of who you're going with at this point, or have a general sense of how you are stacking these candidates, and continually adding more finalists that are outside the bunch to this mix. I don't know how to read that. I don't know how to say, does this mean that Raheem Morris and Brian Callahan and Shane Steichen are all out because they're still looking for another guy, and I guess Aaron Glenn could be available and that's why they're going to him? Or are they just being so thorough that they don't want to leave any stone left unturned, even if they are leaning a guy like Morris or a guy like Callahan? I think it's a fascinating conversation, and I really don't know what to make of it. I can't say one way or the other. I hope that we get a decision here coming up soon, hopefully this weekend or early next week. But I think I was listening to Mike Chappell on his podcast the other day where he was saying, if the guy's going to be Shane Steichen, they probably won't announce until after the Super Bowl, which is like, man, we are going to go on and on with this one. But, at the end of the day, I'd prefer them to be more thorough. I'd prefer them not to go the Josh McDaniels route like they did back in 2018. But I would like to see this get trimmed down pretty soon, because of the 11 candidates left on their initial list of 14. So there were 11 left because D'Amico Ryans took a head coaching job. Dan Quinn and Brian Johnson both dropped out, or Ben Johnson, dropped out. So of those 11 guys, they brought 8 back in for second interviews, 8 for finalists, quote unquote, finalist interviews. So I wonder if they're going to have another round of interviews. Are they going to go to a third round where these interviews are going to go take place over 24 hours straight? Like, I don't know. Are they just going to extend these interviews and keep making them longer and longer? Because at this point, I don't really know what else there is to talk about with these guys. If you're going to call them back in for a third round, like, what have you not talked about already in the first 16 hours? I'm sure you've already shown them the facility. I'm sure that you've already introduced them to some players and talked to, introduced them to the scouting staff. Like, I don't really know what you can do with the third round of interviews. So I'm very curious to see if they go from 8 candidates here on, again, you guys are listening to this on Thursday. So Thursday night, do they drop it down to 1 candidate and we'd hear by Friday or Saturday? Or do they drop this down to 4 and then down to 2 and then down to 1 and we don't hear until the end of February? I don't know, man. I really don't know which way this is going to go. The Colts have been very tight-lipped on this, and I think that's kind of a good thing. Leaks are always crazy, but man, I think I speak for all of you guys when I'm saying I would like to see this make a little more progress here soon, which maybe I'm being a bit impatient, but I just want the next head coach. I want it to be the right decision, and I appreciate how thorough it is. But I also want our next head coach here in Indianapolis. So we're going to talk about a couple other things here in a minute. But first, Locked On is heading to the Senior Bowl. Get inside analysis from the host that covered the NFL's next generation in college and find out which NFL draft boards these players will be climbing. All in one location. Subscribe to the Locked On NFL Draft podcast for nightly live shows from the Senior Bowl on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern time. Next, guys, I also want to tell you about our friends over at PrizePicks, which is daily fantasy made fast and easy. Just pick 2 to 6 players. If they score more or less than their stats projection, then you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch from, and entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It is that easy. Withdrawals are safe and fast as well. And PrizePicks is currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. All right, guys. Well, that's all I really have for today's episode. I know it's a bit of a short one, but if you guys are listening, you have ADHD like me, I feel like we're kind of in waiting mode right now. It's kind of that ADHD waiting mode where I feel like I can't do anything else until we have this head coach things figured out. And that's all we can really talk about right now. It's just the potential head coaching hires and the potential that it could have on the roster. We can't really talk about anything concrete right now. So we are talking more head coaching hires probably tomorrow. Maybe dip our toes into a little bit of draft talk tomorrow because we're a little bit limbo. And again, that ADHD waiting mode. But that's all we have for today, guys. Make sure you're following Locked On Colts at Jake Arthur NFL and at Zach Hicks 2 on Twitter. Also subscribe to the Locked On Colts podcast on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. And thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your next listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast, bringing you the local insights you love to the national spotlight with daily conversations on the biggest NFL stories. Locked On NFL, available on YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. We'll see you guys tomorrow.